The cold winds howled across the barren wasteland of RX-9, a forgotten planet at the edge of the galaxy. The sky was a dull gray, and jagged black mountains stretched into the distance. There was no sign of life, only endless rocky terrain and an eerie silence that made the world feel lifeless. Zerathis, the former queen of the Zorvax Empire, stood at the edge of a cliff, staring at the horizon. Her tall, armored frame looked like a statue against the bleak landscape. She had once been the most powerful ruler of her people, feared and respected across the stars. But now she was nothing more than an outcast, abandoned by her own kind. Her empire had betrayed her. They called her weak. They accused her of failing her duty because she refused to start another war. The High Council, a group of powerful generals, had turned against her. They saw peace as a weakness, and so they stripped her of her crown, shattered her bio-armor, and exiled her to this forsaken world, where she was meant to be forgotten. For weeks, she had wandered across the planet, searching for food, shelter, anything that could keep her alive. But there was little to find. The planet was harsh and unforgiving. She had built a crude shelter inside a cave, but it was barely enough to protect her from the powerful storms that tore through the land. She clenched her fists, her sharp claws scraping against the stone. Her once glowing purple eyes were now dull with exhaustion. "I was a queen," she whispered to herself, "and now I am nothing." But just as she spoke those words, something unusual happened. A bright streak of light cut across the sky, followed by a deafening boom. Zerathis turned sharply, her instincts kicking in. Something had just crashed not far from her cave. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of curiosity. Was it a ship, a meteor, or something else? She hesitated for a moment before making a decision. Her exile had taught her one thing. She could not afford to ignore anything that could help her survive. With long, powerful strides, she made her way toward the crash site. The human stranger. Daniel Carter groaned as he struggled to unbuckle himself from his seat. His ship had taken heavy damage during an unexpected asteroid storm, forcing him to make an emergency landing. The moment his ship hit the surface, he knew it wasn't going to be an easy recovery. He coughed, waving away the smoke inside the cockpit. The control panel was fried, and most of his equipment was useless. The only good news was that he was still alive. "Great," he muttered to himself, stranded on an unknown planet with no way to call for help. Just another perfect day. As he pushed open the emergency hatch, a wave of cold air hit his face. The planet looked as lifeless as it did from space. Dark, rocky, and absolutely depressing. Daniel grabbed his survival pack and climbed out, scanning the area for any signs of danger. He had survived on hostile planets before, but something about this place felt different. It was too quiet. His instincts told him that he wasn't alone. And he was right. From the shadows of the distant cliffs, Zerathis watched him. She had expected wreckage, but instead, she found a human. A small, fragile-looking creature compared to her own kind. His armor was light. His body lacked natural weapons, and yet, he moved with confidence. He wasn't panicking like a lost prey animal. He was assessing the environment, looking for threats, just like a warrior would. For a moment, Zerathis simply observed him. She had never seen a human in person before. Her empire had considered them insignificant, a race with no real power in the grand scheme of the universe. But here he was, alone and unarmed, yet standing without fear. She narrowed her eyes. What was a human doing here? First contact. Daniel felt it before he saw it. A presence. His muscles tensed, and his hand instinctively moved toward his belt, where his survival knife was strapped. He turned his head slowly, and his breath caught in his throat. Standing several feet away was something out of a nightmare. A tall, armored figure, towering over him, its dark, exoskeleton-like armor cracked and scarred. Its glowing purple eyes locked onto him like a predator studying its prey. Daniel took a careful step back, raising his hands. "Hey now, Let's not do anything crazy. Serathis tilted her head. The human was calm, even in the face of an unknown enemy. She could hear his heart pounding, but he wasn't running. Strange. She took a slow step forward, testing his reaction. He didn't flinch. I don't want trouble, Daniel said carefully. Just crashed here. No weapons, no backup. Just me. Serathis studied him for a long moment. His words were simple, but there was no deception in his voice. A part of her wanted to walk away. This human was not her concern. But another part, one she didn't want to acknowledge, felt something unexpected. For weeks, she had been alone, forgotten, exiled. And now, for the first time, there was someone else on this world with her. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and commanding. You will not survive here alone, human. Daniel exhaled, sensing that this was not a threat, but a warning. He gave her a crooked smile. Well then, he said, adjusting his pack. Guess I could use a guide. Serathis didn't smile. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone anymore. The wind howled across the barren wasteland of HFY, carrying dust and ash through the air. Daniel pulled his jacket tighter around his body, shivering slightly. The cold was worse than he had expected. His ship was destroyed, his communications were down, and his rations wouldn't last long. But right now, none of that mattered as much as the alien standing before him. She was taller than any human he had ever seen, her body covered in dark, battle-worn armor. Her glowing purple eyes studied him with sharp intensity, as if she was trying to decide whether to help him or leave him to die. Daniel had heard stories about the Zorvax Empire before, how they were ruthless warriors, feared across the galaxy. And yet this one, Serathis, was here, alone, exiled, a fallen queen. He wasn't sure if that made her more dangerous or more like him. Finally, after what felt like forever, Serathis spoke. Follow me. Daniel hesitated, just like that. She narrowed her eyes. You wish to survive, don't you? That was enough reason for him. He slung his survival pack over his shoulder and nodded. Lead the way. The Queen's shelter. They walked in silence across the rocky terrain, moving toward the mountains in the distance. The journey was rough. Loose stones made it hard to keep balance, and the wind was relentless. But Daniel forced himself to keep going. After what felt like an eternity, they'd reached a narrow cave entrance hidden between jagged rocks. Serathis motioned for him to enter. Inside, the air was warmer, and the walls blocked out the wind. A makeshift fire pit sat in the middle, the faint embers glowing softly. Along the walls, there were small piles of supplies, dried alien plants, sharpened rocks, and metal scraps. Daniel glanced around. You've been here for a while. Serathis didn't respond immediately. She knelt near the fire, placing a small piece of fuel into the embers. The flames flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Finally, she said, 71 cycles. Daniel frowned. 71. Wait, are you saying you've been here alone for over a year? She didn't look at him. Longer by your human time. Daniel exhaled slowly. A year, alone on a wasteland like this. He couldn't imagine it. He had only crashed today, and he already felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. How did you even survive this long? He asked. Serathis gestured to the cave. The land is harsh, but not dead. There is food if you know where to look. There is water beneath the rocks. The storms are dangerous, but they pass. She looked at him then, her eyes glowing softly in the dim light. Humans do not last long in places like this. Daniel smirked. You'd be surprised. We're good at adapting. Serathis watched him for a moment before standing. Rest. You will need your strength. Daniel sighed and sat against the cave wall, stretching out his sore legs. He had 1,000 questions running through his mind. But for now, he was just grateful to be alive. A test of strength. Daniel woke up hours later to the sound of movement. Xerathis was sharpening a stone blade, her hands moving with precise skill. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. What's the plan? Xerathis didn't look up. You need food, water, supplies, and you will not last long if you cannot defend yourself. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You're saying I need a weapon. She tossed the stone blade toward him. He barely caught it. Xerathis stood, towering over him. Show me what you can do, human. Daniel frowned. You mean, fight you? She stepped back, taking a stance. If you wish to survive, you must prove that you are not weak. Daniel sighed, rolling his shoulders. He had trained in hand-to-hand combat, but he wasn't sure how well that would work against an 8-foot-tall alien warrior. Still, he wasn't about to back down. He gripped the blade tightly and lunged forward. Xerathis sidestepped easily, knocking his arm aside with barely any effort. He stumbled but quickly regained his footing. Too slow, she said. Daniel gritted his teeth. She was toying with him. He tried again, feinting left before swinging right. This time, he managed to graze her armor, but it did nothing. Before he could react, she moved, faster than he thought possible. In a single motion, she disarmed him and pinned him against the cave wall. Daniel groaned. Okay, yeah, I see your point. Xerathis stepped back, tossing the blade onto the ground. You have skill, but skill is not enough. Daniel exhaled, shaking out his arms. What, you want me to train with you? She folded her arms. If you do not, you will die. Daniel smirked. Well, when you put it like that. Xerathis watched him carefully. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she had not felt in years, a strange sense of curiosity. This human was weaker than her, slower, smaller, but he did not give up. Perhaps he was not as fragile as she thought. As Daniel picked up the blade again, she decided she would find out. The morning on Verex 9 was cold and silent. Daniel woke up to the sound of the wind whistling through the cave entrance. He sat up, rubbing his sore arms. The training from yesterday had left him exhausted. Across from him, Xerathis was already awake, sharpening her blade with smooth, practiced movements. She barely acknowledged him as he stretched his stiff muscles. You wake late, she said without looking up. Daniel groaned. I didn't know we had a schedule. Xerathis finally glanced at him. Survival does not wait for you to be ready. Daniel sighed. He couldn't argue with that. A lesson in hunting. After a quick meal of dried alien plants, Xerathis stood and gestured for him to follow. Come, she said. You must learn to hunt. Daniel hesitated. What are we hunting? Xerathis didn't answer immediately. She led him out of the cave and into the open wasteland. The gray sky stretched endlessly above them, and the wind carried the scent of dust and metal. The creatures of this world are not like those of Earth, Xerathis said. They are strong. Some are dangerous. Daniel frowned. And you think I'm ready for this? She gave him a challenging look. We will find out. They moved carefully across the rocky ground. Xerathis walked with silent grace, her sharp eyes scanning the area. Daniel did his best to follow her movements, but he was painfully aware of how loud his footsteps sounded. After a while, Xerathis raised a hand. Daniel froze. Ahead of them, a strange creature moved between the rocks. It was small, about the size of a dog, with 6 thin legs and rough, spiked skin. Its head had no eyes, only a mouth filled with sharp teeth. Xerathis crouched low. This one is weak, but fast. You will take it down. Daniel's eyes widened. Me? Alone? Xerathis nodded. If you cannot kill something this small, you will not survive here. Daniel swallowed hard. He gripped his stone blade and took a slow step forward. The creature's head twitched, as if sensing him. Then, in a flash, it darted forward. Daniel barely had time to react. He swung wildly, but the creature was too quick. It leaped at him, and he stumbled backward, barely dodging its sharp claws. "Too slow," Xerathis said behind him. Daniel gritted his teeth. He needed to focus. The creature circled him, growling. It was watching him, testing him. Daniel took a deep breath. Instead of rushing, he waited. He watched how the creature moved, how it shifted its weight before attacking. Then, when it lunged again, he was ready. He sidestepped and brought the blade down hard. The stone edge sliced into the creature's side, and it let out a sharp screech before collapsing onto the ground. Daniel stood there, breathing hard, his heart pounding. Xerathis approached, looking at the creature's lifeless body. She nodded. "Better." Daniel wiped his forehead. "So, what now?" Xerathis pulled out a smaller knife and crouched beside the creature. "Now we take what we need." Daniel watched as she expertly removed parts of the creature's body, taking meat for food, bones for tools, and the rough skin for armor. "You waste nothing," she said. "Everything has a purpose." Daniel nodded. He was starting to understand. Survival wasn't just about strength. It was about using what you had wisely. The first storm. They returned to the cave, carrying the supplies from the hunt. The air felt different. Xerathis frowned, looking toward the distant horizon. The sky had darkened, thick clouds swirling. The wind had picked up, carrying a low, eerie sound. Daniel followed her gaze. "That doesn't look good." Xerathis' expression was serious. "A storm is coming." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Like a sandstorm." She shook her head. "Worse." Without another word, she moved quickly, gathering supplies and securing the entrance of the cave with heavy stones. Daniel helped as best as he could. "How bad are we talking?" Xerathis didn't answer right away. Then she said, "It can tear flesh from bone." Daniel stopped. "Oh, great." As the wind howled louder, they retreated into the cave. The fire flickered, casting deep shadows across the walls. Then, with a deafening roar, the storm hit. Trapped together, the cave shook as powerful winds slammed against the rocks. Daniel could hear the sound of sharp debris crashing outside. He sat near the fire, glancing at Xerathis. She seemed calm, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "How long will this last?" he asked. Xerathis poked at the fire with a metal rod. "Hours, maybe longer." Daniel sighed. "And we just wait." She looked at him. "Do you have a better idea?" He chuckled. "Not really." A long silence settled between them. The storm raged outside, but inside the cave, it was strangely peaceful. Daniel watched as Xerathis removed a piece of armor, revealing a scarred shoulder beneath. She moved her arm carefully, as if testing an old wound. He hesitated before asking, "How did it happen?" Xerathis didn't answer right away. She stared at the flames, her expression unreadable. "Betrayal," she finally said. Daniel didn't push further. He could see that this was a painful memory. Instead, he leaned back against the cave wall. "For what it's worth, I don't think you deserved it." Xerathis glanced at him. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of surprise. But she said nothing. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, two souls, a human and an exiled queen, began to understand each other. The storm had raged through the night. The wind howled like a beast outside, and sharp debris struck the cave walls like the claws of an unseen predator. But inside, Daniel and Xerathis sat near the small fire, trapped together by nature's fury. Daniel watched the flickering flames, lost in thought. The alien queen beside him had been betrayed by her own people. He could still hear the bitterness in her voice when she spoke of it. He wanted to ask more, but he knew better than to push her. Instead, he sighed and stretched his sore arms. "Do these storms happen often?" Xerathis, who had been sharpening her blade, didn't look up. "Yes. Verix9 is not kind to the weak." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, I figured that out already." She finally glanced at him. Yet you survived." Her words surprised him. Was that a compliment? He wasn't sure, but he could tell she was starting to respect him, even if she didn't say it out loud. The first challenge. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scarred by violent winds. The ground was covered in shattered rocks and twisted remains of alien trees. The air smelled of dust and metal. Daniel and Tirithis stepped outside, scanning the damage. "We will need supplies," Tirithis said. "The storm may have uncovered hidden dangers." Daniel adjusted the makeshift armor he had fashioned from the last hunt. "Let's hope it uncovered something useful too." They set off, moving carefully across the unstable terrain. Daniel was getting better at walking without making too much noise, but he was still nowhere near as graceful as Tirithis. After a while, they came across something unexpected. A small alien creature was struggling in the debris. It had delicate wings, like an insect, but its body was covered in thick fur. One of its legs was trapped under a fallen rock, and it made a soft, pained sound. Xerethis frowned. "Leave it. It will not survive." Daniel hesitated. "We could help it." Xerethis's gaze hardened. "That is not the way of this world. The weak die." Daniel ignored her warning and crouched down. Carefully, he pushed the rock aside. The creature flinched but did not run. It looked up at him with large, shimmering eyes. "It's just a little thing," he muttered. "It doesn't deserve to die like this." He gently picked it up and placed it on a safer patch of ground. It hesitated, then flapped its wings and disappeared into the sky. Xerethis watched the creature fly away, then looked at Daniel with an unreadable expression. "That was foolish." Daniel shrugged. "Maybe, but it felt like the right thing to do." She studied him for a long moment before saying, "You are not like others." Daniel smirked. "No kidding." The hunt begins. As they continued their journey, they came across fresh tracks in the dust. Large, clawed footprints. Something big had passed through here recently. Xerethis crouched beside them. "This is a hunter. A true predator." Daniel swallowed. "And we're following it." She nodded. "We need food. The storm may have driven it from its territory. If we are lucky, it is weak." Daniel wasn't sure lucky was the right word for hunting something that big, but he trusted Xerethis's instincts. They followed the tracks until they reached a deep ravine. The footprints led down into the shadows. Xerethis motioned for silence. Something was moving below. They peered over the edge. A massive creature was there, licking its wounds. It was covered in thick, spiked scales, and its powerful limbs suggested it was a fearsome hunter. But it was injured. The storm had clearly not been kind to it either. Xerethis whispered, "This is our chance." Daniel's heart pounded. This was nothing like hunting small creatures. This thing was a monster. "How do we take it down?" he whispered back. Xerethis' eyes gleamed. "With patience." A desperate fight. They crept closer, using the rocks as cover. The creature was still recovering, but one wrong move and it would tear them apart. Xerethis pulled out a spear she had crafted and motioned for Daniel to move to the side. "We will strike together. Aim for the neck." Daniel gripped his stone blade, nerves tightening in his chest. Xerethis moved first. Like a shadow, she leaped from the rocks, spear raised. The spear struck true, sinking into the creature's thick hide. It let out a thunderous roar, shaking the ground. Daniel didn't have time to think. The creature lashed out, its powerful claws slicing through the air. Xerethis barely dodged in time. "Now, human," she shouted. Daniel forced his fear aside and charged forward. He dodged the creature's snapping jaws and drove his blade deep into the exposed wound. The monster let out a final, pained howl, then collapsed. For a moment, everything was silent. Daniel took a shaky breath. They had done it. Xerethis approached the body, retrieving her spear. She looked at Daniel with approval. "You fought well." Daniel wiped sweat from his brow. "Yeah, well, I didn't want to die. She smirked. Good motivation. Respect earned. They carved up the beast, gathering its meat, bones, and hide. It would be enough to last them for weeks. As they worked, Daniel noticed Seraphis watching him differently. Not as a burden, not as an outsider, but as something more. You learn quickly, she said. Daniel smiled. I have a good teacher. For the first time, Seraphis didn't argue. As they carried their prize back to the cave, Daniel felt something shift between them. Not just survival. Trust. The fire crackled softly in the cave as Daniel and Seraphis sat beside their hard-earned prize. The beast they had slain had given them enough meat to last for weeks, but Daniel knew that survival on Ferex 9 was never that simple. Seraphis sharpened her spear, her golden eyes flickering in the firelight. We will need to move soon, she said. Daniel frowned. Move? Why? We finally have food and shelter. She glanced toward the entrance of the cave. Because the scent of blood will attract others. Daniel's stomach twisted. He had fought to survive here, but he hadn't thought about what else might be watching them. A strange noise. The night was still. Too still. Daniel lay near the fire, listening. The usual distant sounds of creatures moving in the night were absent. Even the wind had gone quiet. Then, a faint clicking sound. Daniel sat up instantly. Did you hear that? He whispered. Seraphis was already awake. She had her spear in hand, eyes narrowed toward the darkness beyond the cave. Stay close. They waited. The clicking sound returned, this time closer. Then a shadow shifted at the entrance. Daniel's breath caught. A shake moved on the rocks, almost blending into the darkness. Seraphis tensed. It followed the scent. The predator revealed. A massive insect-like creature crawled into view. It had long, spindly limbs and a hard chitinous exoskeleton. Its black eyes reflected the firelight as it clicked its mandibles. Daniel's heart pounded. What the hell is that? A night stalker, Seraphis whispered. A true hunter. The creature's razor-sharp claws tapped against the stone as it crept forward. It was patient, studying them. It was not afraid. Seraphis tightened her grip on her spear. It sees us as prey. Daniel gulped. How do we stop it? She glanced at the fire. They hate light. But we must strike before it gets too close. The fight for survival. The night stalker suddenly lunged. Seraphis spun out of the way, thrusting her spear forward, but the creature moved too fast. It twisted, dodging her strike, then swiped at Daniel. He barely managed to roll aside as its claws slashed the ground where he had stood. Seraphis growled. We must corner it. Daniel's mind raced. Corner it. In a cave. Then he saw it. The fire. Seraphis, we can use the fire, he shouted. She nodded. Lead it there. Daniel grabbed a burning stick and swung it wildly. The night stalker hissed and recoiled, clicking its mandibles angrily. Seraphis used the distraction. She leaped forward, spear aimed at its exposed underbelly. The blade struck deep. The night stalker let out a horrific screech, thrashing violently. Daniel drove his flaming stick into its face, the fire searing its exoskeleton. The creature shuddered, then collapsed, its body twitching before finally going still. A new understanding. Daniel fell back, breathing heavily. That was too close. Seraphis stood over the fallen predator, pulling her spear free. She wiped the blood from the blade, then looked at Daniel with something different in her expression. You think like a warrior, she said. Daniel smirked. I think like someone who doesn't want to die. She tilted her head. Same thing. For the first time, she smiled at him. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Daniel felt a strange warmth in his chest. Not just survival. Something more. A dangerous world. By dawn, they had left the cave behind, moving toward higher ground. The night stalker was alone. Seraphis said, That is unusual. Daniel frowned. You think more of them are coming? She nodded. It is possible. But there is something else. I have never seen one so bold. Daniel shivered. Maybe the storm forced them out. Maybe. But Xerathis looked unconvinced. Something was changing on Verex-9, and Daniel had the sinking feeling they were running out of time. The morning sun barely touched the rocky landscape as Daniel and Xerathis moved swiftly through the terrain. The battle with the Night Stalker had left them shaken, but there was no time to rest. Daniel adjusted the straps of his makeshift backpack. Where exactly are we heading? Xerathis glanced at the horizon. There is an abandoned outpost a few miles from here. My people built it long ago. Will there be supplies? She nodded. If it has not been raided. Daniel exhaled. They needed shelter, weapons, and a real plan if they wanted to survive. But as they continued forward, a disturbing feeling grew inside him. They were being watched. Shadows in the rocks. The path became steeper, forcing them to climb. The rocky cliffs around them created too many blind spots. Daniel's eyes darted across the landscape. I don't like this. It's too quiet. Xerathis agreed. Predators do not usually travel alone. Something else is near. Then, a sudden flash of movement above them. Daniel barely had time to react before a figure leaped down from the cliffs, landing just a few feet away. His heart pounded as more shapes appeared, stepping out from the shadows. Not beasts, not wild creatures. Alien warriors. The hunter becomes the hunted. The newcomers wore dark armor, their faces hidden behind sleek helmets. They carried energy weapons, but they did not fire. Xerathis stiffened. Valkyrie warriors, she whispered. Daniel swallowed. Friends of yours? She shook her head. Enemies. One of the warriors, taller than the rest, stepped forward. He removed his helmet, revealing sharp violet eyes and deep scars across his face. Xerathis, he said, his voice cold. You should not be alive. Xerathis tightened her grip on her spear. Neither should you, Vorik. Daniel could feel the tension like a storm about to break. Who was this warrior? And why did he seem to know Xerathis? A dark past. Vorik's gaze flicked to Daniel. You travel with a human. He smirked. How pathetic. Have you truly fallen so low? Xerathis did not flinch. You followed me all this way just to insult me. Vorik stepped closer. You were exiled, abandoned by your own kind. And yet you still fight to survive. He laughed. For what? Daniel could feel Xerathis' anger building. But she stayed calm. I fight, she said, because I choose to. Vorik's smile faded. Then you are a fool. A desperate escape. Without warning, Vorik raised his weapon. Daniel moved on instinct. He grabbed Xerathis and pulled her aside just as Vorik fired. The blast struck the rock behind them, sending shards flying. Run, Xerathis shouted. Daniel didn't argue. They sprinted toward the cliffs as the Valkyrie warriors gave chase. Blaster shots whizzed past them, scorching the ground. The only way out was up. Xerathis grabbed Daniel's arm. Climb. Daniel scrambled up the jagged rocks, his hands slipping on the rough surface. His heart pounded as the enemy closed in. Then, a hand grabbed his ankle. Fighting back, Daniel kicked hard, knocking the warrior away. He pulled himself up just as Xerathis spun, throwing her spear with deadly accuracy. The weapon struck a warrior in the chest, sending him tumbling down. Daniel reached for a loose rock and hurled it at another enemy, hitting his helmet. The warrior stumbled. Go, Xerathis shouted. They climbed higher, reaching the top of the ridge. Below, Vorik growled in frustration. You cannot run forever. Daniel gritted his teeth. Maybe not, but they would not go down easily. A dangerous truth. They finally stopped at a safe distance, catching their breath. Daniel looked at Xerathis. Who is Vorik? She hesitated. A war leader. He was once one of my strongest warriors. Daniel frowned. Why is he after you? She sighed. Because he was the one who exiled me. Daniel stared at her, and now he wants to finish what he started. She nodded. Yes, and he will not stop until I am dead. Daniel clenched his fists. This was no longer just about survival. It was war. The wind howled across the barren cliffs as Daniel and Terathis stood at the edge, looking down at the advancing Valkyrie warriors below. The battle was not over yet. Vorik wanted blood, and he would not stop until Xerathis was dead. Daniel clenched his fists. We can't outrun them forever. Xerathis nodded. Then we stop running. She pulled out a small metal device from her belt and pressed a button. It beeped softly. Daniel frowned. What's that? A distress signal, she said. If anyone still loyal to me is out there, they will come. Daniel wasn't sure how much hope that gave them. What if no one answered? But they didn't have time to think. The enemy was getting closer. The first strike. Vorik and his warriors scaled the cliff with deadly precision. Their glowing weapons cast an eerie light on the rocks. Xerathis turned to Daniel. We fight together. Daniel smirked. I was hoping you'd say that. As the first Valkyrie reached the top, Xerathis spun her spear, striking with quick, precise movements. The enemy stumbled back, but another warrior leaped forward. Daniel grabbed a loose metal pipe from the wreckage nearby and swung hard. The impact sent the warrior crashing down. Another enemy lunged. Daniel dodged, rolling to the side. He wasn't a trained soldier, but he fought with everything he had. Xerathis moved like lightning, her spear slicing through the air. 2 more warriors fell, but more kept coming. Then Vorik arrived. The final battle. Vorik locked eyes with Xerathis. This is where it ends. Xerathis gripped her spear tightly. For you, maybe. Vorik lunged. Their weapons clashed, sending sparks flying. He was strong, faster than the others. But Xerathis was determined. Daniel fought off another warrior, barely dodging a blade aimed at his chest. He grabbed a fallen blaster, aimed, and fired. The warrior dropped instantly. But then, Vorik overpowered Xerathis, pinning her against the rocks. You were always weak, he snarled. Daniel acted without thinking. He charged forward and tackled Vorik. The two rolled across the ground, fists flying. Vorik was stronger, but Daniel fought with pure determination. He punched hard, knocking the alien leader back. Xerathis seized the chance. She grabbed her spear and drove it through Vorik's shoulder. He let out a roar of pain, falling to his knees. Reinforcements arrive. Before the remaining warriors could attack, a loud rumbling filled the air. Daniel looked up. A ship appeared in the sky, its engines glowing bright. Xerathis' distress signal had worked. Her people had come. The ship fired warning shots, and the remaining Valkyrie warriors fled. Daniel turned to Xerathis. Looks like you're not alone after all. She smiled. No, I am not. A new beginning. As the ship landed, Xerathis' loyal warriors stepped out. One of them, an older warrior, bowed. We thought you were lost, my queen. Daniel blinked. Queen. Xerathis sighed. I did not tell you everything. I was once the ruler of my people, before Vorik betrayed me. Daniel stared. He had been traveling with royalty this whole time. She stepped closer. And now, I can reclaim what was lost. Daniel grinned. I guess that makes me your royal bodyguard now. She chuckled. Something like that. As they boarded the ship, Daniel realized something. He had come to this world as an outsider, but now he was a part of something greater. And beside Xerathis, he would face whatever came next. Together,